Well, let's have a look at the so-called trajectory. We'll just swoop down if we can, and we'll see Eastern Europe and Poland and the particular place which is called Purkiss. There we are, all right? Now, it's 4 miles from the Ukrainian border. The border is south of Purkiss. Investigations are underway, as President Biden said. There are options here. It's possible. Yes, a stray missile from Russia landed, and Russia apparently fired 85 missiles in Ukraine yesterday. It could have been deliberate. That's the worst possible option. Could have been an accident. Could also have been something from Ukraine, either one of their missiles or part of their air defense system that went astray. Either way, you look at this place, okay, it looks pretty rural. It's 2 Polish deaths because of this war, and Poland is in NATO, Marina.
And this is where it gets really scary, because the whole NATO agreement is if one of the NATO countries is attacked, we are all attacked, right? So if this is proven to be a Russian missile, then what are the next steps? Because if we don't act, then it shows Russia, Putin, that we will let this sort of thing fly. Yeah. And I think that's where it gets really, really scary.
We know that the missile parts were Russian-made. We do know that. I noticed that the guy who runs NATO last night, is it Jens Stoltenberg, said we need to find out if it was an accident or deliberate. Now, last night they were more suspicious that it was Russia. There's a bit more doubt. They seem to be saying, Mike, that if it's an accident, we might let it pass.
Well, I think they're going to have to. The word I keep hearing this morning is cool heads. You know, let's not rush into prejudgment. I've listened to a few security experts this morning. I'm not a security expert, but the general theory now seems to be that it was a Ukrainian defence missile trying to intercept the Russian missiles going into the Ukraine, and the two collided. Nobody knows the missile parts that you're talking about, would you hit the ground? Nobody knows which missile those parts they've identified have come from. So at the moment, I think the benefit of the doubt is being given to the fact that it is an accident, because Putin, although a madman and a tyrant, and he was firing 85 missiles into Ukraine yesterday while this happened, OK? But military experts are saying he seems to still retain a bit of rationality. You know, when there are areas of this war that he's losing, he withdraws his troops and moves them elsewhere, and that he wouldn't do such a foolish thing.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has been giving a press conference from the G20 summit in Bali. Take a look.
In the wake of these attacks, today we held an urgent meeting of allies to underscore our solidarity with Ukraine and Poland. I also spoke to Polish President Duda this morning to offer my wholehearted support and assurance that the United Kingdom stands steadfastly behind him and his people at this worrying time.
Let us talk now to our friend Professor Anthony Glees, who's an expert on international affairs and security. I'm guessing when you went to bed last night when we were thinking it was Russia, Anthony, you feared the worst.
Well, I did, but there were reports that though it was a Russian-made missile, it could have been a Ukrainian missile, not a Russian one. But, you know, listening to what President Biden was saying there, I think there is still a big question mark over whether the trajectory proves that the missile was Ukrainian rather than Russian. It could be that President Biden, like his NATO colleagues, is actually needing time to think about the correct response. It might not necessarily mean that they think that the missile was indeed a Ukrainian missile. It's not certain. And above all, it seems to me that sooner or later, this kind of thing was bound to happen, that sooner or later, the prospect of a more general European war becomes ever more stark, because what started as a horrible, conventional, aggressive attack on Ukraine, one that we have helped Ukraine effectively repel now, is turning into a rocket war against Ukraine. And rockets can go all over the place. And what will our response be if Ukraine is able to defeat Russia on the battlefield, but loses in the skies?
Oh, what a thought. It sounds, Anthony, as if listening to Biden, as you say, who's got all this uncertainty, even listening to the NATO chiefs, they're going to find any excuse they can not to find Russia guilty, which will mean they would have to act.
Well, they might want to play for time. We know that the head of the CIA has met with his Russian counterpart in Turkey. And of course, we don't know what they agreed. We're told, or even if they agreed, we're told they discussed America's response, NATO's response, if so-called theater nuclear weapons were used in Ukraine out of desperation, because Putin knows that he is losing and losing definitively and decisively. But it's also possible that they talked about ways in which a peace that we all want, including the Ukrainians, of course, a peace could be manufactured. Now, it would be a very strong hold to have over Russia to be able to say, we know that that was, in fact, a Russian weapon. We're not going to make a big deal out of it if you now sue for peace. And that's the way wars can often end. Putin thinks he can obliterate Ukraine from the skies. The experience of the Second World War and Vietnam suggests that ain't necessarily so. But we could get drawn in. And in my view, we need to do everything now to ensure that Putin cannot win the war in the skies, just as we helped him to ensure that he would not lose the war on the battlefield.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Anthony Glees. It makes perfect sense, that, Marina, doesn't it?
It does, and I really hope that is the case. And my worry is this is the Franz Ferdinand moment.
The shot in Sarajevo that started World War One.
That's my fear.
Yeah. Well, they've got to, there's been a big book published about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's quite clear that when it started, obviously started because Russia put missiles in Cuba right next to the USA. In the 60s, JFK was given, the generals all wanted to go for it. They were all saying, well, we reckon we can let off 40 nuclear weapons tomorrow. And JFK said, no, if that we've lost if we do that.
Yeah, there was one submarine commander who thought he'd been instructed to launch a nuclear missile on Cuba. That's how close it got.
Yeah.
And he ignored the instruction because it was an erroneous instruction. That's how easily it can start.
It is. I mean, did you go to bed worried last night, Mike?
No, I didn't really, because I've covered a couple of wars myself, out there, and you realise that there's always collateral damage in a war between two countries which are next to each other. And I'm talking about the Middle East, and I've done Israel and the Lebanon and all that, and everybody gets dragged in. So the collateral damage is an understanding necessity you have to deal with.